I was invited to join an 8-player friendly Pokemon Stadium tournament. Nintendo recently released Pokemon Stadium on the Switch as part of their online service. That means we can now play Pokemon Stadium online without using an emulator. If this sounds too good to be true, it's because it is. A huge part of the Pokemon Stadium experience is being able to use your own Pokemon, and of course, for whatever reason, Nintendo didn't allow that. That means for this tournament, we're stuck using rental Pokemon, which, in my opinion, adds a lot more charm. You see, these rental Pokemon have some pretty questionable movesets. Because of this, Pokemon like Alakazam end up being less desirable than Kadabra, and I think that's neat. Now, I may not look it, but I was only 2 years old when Pokemon Stadium was first released, so I never played it growing up. Actually, this tournament is my first time ever battling in Generation 1 competitively. Before the tournament begun, we had to choose which 6 Pokemon we'd be using for all of our battles. The only Pokemon off limits were Mew and Mewtwo. That leaves us with 149 rental Pokemon to choose from. We had a rule in place that only allowed 1 evasion altering move per team. Generation 1 battles are already an RNG fest without abusing accuracy too much, so this makes sense. Besides that, the rules are pretty simple, 66 single battles, and we're using a bracket to determine the overall winner. If you're like me and you never played competitively in Generation 1, don't worry, I still don't understand how it all works myself, but what I do know is that the faster the Pokemon, the higher the crit chance. That's why my first choice for this tournament was between Persian and Tauros. The moveset for the rental Persian may not look like much at first, but because of Persian's high speed and in turn Persian's high crit rate, Slash has a 99.6% chance of landing a critical hit. Typically, Tauros is the king of Generation 1, but after doing some calcs, Persian was consistently outputting more damage than the rental Tauros. My next choice was undeniably Zapdos. Electric Flying is a crazy good defensive type, and the moveset for Zapdos isn't too shabby either. Consistent damage with Thunderbolt, Sky Attack for switch predictions, Flash for my only evasion altering move, and Thunder Wave is never a bad thing. Typically when making a good Pokemon team you want type diversity. Not in Generation 1 though. Something to know about Generation 1 is Psychic types are the best. Dark and Steel didn't exist yet, and there's only 3 Ghost type moves. And out of all the rental Pokemon, Beedrill and Jolteon are the only ones with Bug type damaging moves, those being Twin Needle and Pin Missile. So I chose Jinx and Slowbro for my team. Jinx has a respectable speed stat of 95 and also has access to Lovely Kiss. Lovely Kiss is one of the more reliable sleep-inducing moves with 75% accuracy. Not to mention it has Psychic, which 1/3 of the time lowers the opponent's special stat by 1 stage. Oh yeah, for the uninformed, in Generation 1 there was no special attack or special defense, but rather a special stat, which is a combination of the two. This means if your special got lowered, not only are you taking more special damage, you're also outputting less special damage. This makes Psychic a great attack to fire off even if you think your opponent is going to switch into a special wall, because there's always a chance that you could lower what is essentially 2 stats at once. And then there's Ice Punch, which not only is a great damaging move, but it also has a 10% chance to freeze. And let me tell you, you do not want to be frozen in Generation 1. The only way to be unthawed is if you're hit by a fire type attack or if your opponent uses Haze. It is impossible to thaw out by yourself. Getting frozen is a death sentence for your Pokemon. As for Slowbro, Surf and Psychic are the main moves I'll be using here. I don't see many situations where I would use Withdraw, and Disable only has 55% accuracy. On top of that, if you do hit the target, it disables a randomly selected attack rather than the last attack used. Slowbro has great defenses, and that's what we're going to be relying on it for. Speaking of great defenses, my 5th choice was Snorlax. My second normal type, yes, but the only weakness normal types have is fighting, which are easily scared away by all the psychic types. Snorlax has Mega Kick, which packs a hell of a punch. The trade-off is that it's 75% accuracy, but it's worth it. Snorlax also has Rock Slide, which is nice coverage for all the legendary birds we'll likely see. That leaves 1 space left on my team. I highly considered Charizard, but that would leave me with no electric resists. My team needed a ground type, and I determined Graveler to be the best choice. It's one of those situations where it just has better moves than its evolution. You don't have to be a genius to know how good Earthquake is, and Seismic Toss is great for fixed damage. Then there's Self-Destruct. In Generation 1, Self-Destruct has 130 power. On top of that, it halves the target's defense stat during the damage calculation, essentially making it a 260 power move. This is a great move to pick off otherwise hard to beat Pokemon and allows a clean switch in afterwards. With my team now selected, it's time for the tournament. My first match is against Nexus. Everyone in this tournament is a competitive battler, but out of everyone, I know Nexus the best. His team was quite frightening. Half his Pokemon were the same as mine, and the ones that were different were Pokemon I considered using myself, except Golduck. I don't know why he has a Golduck. I decided to lead Jinx, while he leads with Persian. Knowing how much damage this Pokemon does, I definitely wanted to put it to sleep. Sleep in Generation 1 works differently. The turn your Pokemon wakes up counts as a move being used, so there's no fear of a Pokemon waking up first turn and destroying you. Don't miss. Please don't miss. No, bruh. Off to a great start. I decide to save Jinx for later since Nexus has a Nidoqueen, and I switch into Slowbro. Slash does about 30% and I decide to use Disable. At this point, I was under the impression Disable works like it does in later games, but of course, I know now it doesn't. Zapdos switches in and ends up getting its Thunderbolt disabled, which is very lucky, but I didn't see that at the time, and I switched into Graveler to take an oncoming electric attack. Since Nexus couldn't use Thunderbolt, he also switched that same turn into Snorlax. I'm finally in a better position since the only way Snorlax can damage Graveler is getting lucky with Metronome. I use Earthquake and do about 30% damage to the Snorlax. Nexus rolls the dice and he tries to use Metronome. He gets Guillotine, which at first had me sweating, but in Generation 1, Oko moves can only work if you're faster or equal to in speed as the opposing Pokemon. Since Graveler was faster, Guillotine would have never worked. It's also worth noting that the speed difference doesn't affect the accuracy of the Oko move. I land another Earthquake, taking the Snorlax down to 27% health, and this time he rolls a Fire Blast. In Gen 1, Fire Blast has a 30% chance to burn, but thankfully that didn't end up happening. I Earthquake one last time as Nexus lets his Snorlax go for a clean switch into Golduck. I knew Nexus would likely Toxic, predicting me to switch into my Slowbro, but I didn't want to make any unnecessary plays since, in my opinion, I already had the upper hand. I switch into Slowbro and thankfully he missed, making up for the lovely kiss at the start of the battle. He doubled down and went for Toxic again, which also missed, and I fire off a Psychic which lowers Golduck's special stat. At this point I do feel kinda bad, but this is the game we play and I'll take any hacks I can get. Nexus switches out Golduck into Zapdos and takes Psychic very well. I switch into Graveler to take on oncoming electric attack, but Zapdos uses Flash instead. I predict the switch into Golduck, so I double swap into my own Zapdos as Nexus does exactly that. I then decide to triple switch into Jinx, predicting Nidoqueen to come in to take a Thunderbolt, and I was right again. At this point, I figured damaging a Nidoqueen was worth sacking Jinx, so I fire off a Psychic, and I wind up getting a lucky crit, which straight up takes Nidoqueen out. This is huge because it lets my Zapdos run wild now that Nexus has no resistances to Thunderbolt. Now that Nidoqueen is gone, I let Nexus's Persian take out my Jinx, so I can get a clean switch into my Snorlax. I get growled by Persian, but despite this, Mega Kick still does about 60% of the Persian's health. Then Zapdos swaps in and is taken down to 30% of its health. When I said Snorlax packs a punch, I meant it. I switch into Graveler because it hardwalls Zapdos and he goes for Flash once again. This time, however, it missed. I decided enough was enough and I use Self-Destruct, and despite Nexus's best efforts at lowering my accuracy, it connects and Zapdos is out of the picture. We both send in our Persians, and thanks to the damage done by Snorlax, I'm guaranteed to win a 1v1 even if he wins the speed tie, which he does. His last two remaining Pokemon are easy work for my Persian, but being uncertain if I would take out the Golduck with its remaining HP, I switch into Slowbro to chip it down. After some back and forth, the Golduck goes down, and all that remains on Nexus' side is the Kadabra. I let him chip down and take out my Slowbro for a clean switch into Persian and end the battle with a 3-0 victory in my favor. Looking back at this match, there was a lot more luck involved than I realized, and I think Nexus got the short end of the stick. However, a win is a win, and we move forward onto our second match against Kerpai. Kerpai has an interesting team, less overlap than Nexus as we only share Zapdos and Persian. Charizard stood out to me because of Fire Spin. In Generation 1, Fire Spin is one of the 4 partial trapping moves. A partial trapping move stops your opponent from attacking altogether during the entire 2 to 5 turns the attack lasts for. This means if you're faster than your opponent, you can keep using the attack over and over again and they cannot hit you back. Thankfully, the move can miss, but it's still a problem and leaves your fate up to chance. Because of this, I have to prioritize keeping Zapdos and Persian around. Persian is faster than Charizard, and Zapdos speed ties with it. This is my best bet at taking it out without relying on a miracle. Kerpai leads with Persian, which I figured they would. Leading the fastest Pokemon on your team so you can outspeed the opponent makes a lot of sense. Knowing this, I could have led with my own Persian and left it up to a coin flip of which would go down. But as I mentioned, I wanted to keep my Persian healthy this battle, so I led with the bulky Slowbro. Looking at their team, I decided I wanted to surf on the off chance Charizard or Marowak came in. Looking back at it, it would have made more sense to predict Blastoise and use Psychic, but I can't explain what came over me. I had a good feeling that one of the two were going to come in, and I was right. The Surf does about 85% of the Charizard's health, which is more than enough for Persian to pick it off later. Charizard uses Fire Spin and chips my Slowbro down for a few turns before it gets fed up and switched out into Blastoise. We trade a few hits, I go for Psychic, he goes for Seismic Toss. Realizing that one more Seismic Toss took me out, I switch into Snorlax since it has a giant HP stat. Fearing that Mega Kick will miss, I go for a Rock Slide, and I'm just shy of taking out the Blastoise. This leads my Snorlax to taking extra unnecessary damage. Overall, the Blastoise did a number on my 2 bulkiest Pokemon. Fixed damaging moves are no joke. From there, Kerpai's Persian came in to finish off my Snorlax. I let this happen so I can get a clean switch into my own Persian. At this point, trading Persian seemed like my best option. The rental Persian has Bubble Beam, which I know would take out my Graveler. Slowbro is in range of being taken out by a slash. Jinx easily gets 2-hit KO'd, so if I miss a Lovely Kiss, I'm even more screwed. And I thought Zapdos could possibly get 2-hit KO'd by Persian. Despite believing I was going to be trading Persians, Kerpai had a different idea and instead switched into Drowsy for what I can only assume was to sack it off. This allowed for a clean switch into Marowak. Since Marowak doesn't get Thick Club in Generation 1, an item that usually doubles its attack stat, I severely underestimated it. I thought Persian would have been able to 2-hit KO with Slash, but I was mistaken. However, I would have been able to if I got lucky by using Bubble Beam and if one of my 2 attacks was a crit. Marowak uses Boomerang and gets a crit, which leaves my Persian on exactly 1 HP. Taking this as a hint I should save my Persian, I decide to swap out into my Slowbro to sack it off, as the Marowak goes for a Focus Energy, a risky move that could pay off massively. Had I stayed in and slashed on that turn, that would have put Marowak in range of being taken out. Despite the Focus Energy, we avoid the crit, and Slowbro somehow survives the Marowak's Boomerang as we finish it off with a Surf. Charizard comes in to finish off the Slowbro with a Fire Spin, which allows me to bring in Persian. Charizard isn't done yet and switches out for Zapdos, which gets 2-hit KO'd by my Persian Slash before it could get the chance to do anything. My opponent's last 2 Pokemon are Charizard and Persian. Charizard is low health, but the Persian has full HP. I decide to sack off my Graveler since it struggles to beat either of them. I may have more Pokemon, but I'm definitely in a tight spot. Persian is faster and 2-hit KOs both my Jinx and Zapdos, and while it's above half HP, it also beats my Persian, and that's assuming I would win a speed tie. This effectively gives me 1 attack to use from each of my Pokemon, so all I can do is pray a Psychic from a Jinx and a Thunderbolt from a Zapdos is enough to stop this Persian. Otherwise, it comes down to a coin flip. Thankfully, it was enough, and I'm able to finish off the Charizard with a Thunderbolt. Winning the second match put me through to the semi-finals of the winner's bracket, which is a lot better than I expected to do. That means my next opponent is Owen, the organizer of the event. His team is by far the most unique we've seen so far, with the only overlap being Jinx, and he also has a Poliwag. This is a good time to mention that out of all the rental Pokemon, Poliwag and Slowpoke were the only ones to have Amnesia. A terrifying move in Generation 1, since it boosts your special stat by 2 stages. Think of it like a Pokemon with the simple ability using Calm Mind. I wasn't worried about Poliwag though, my concerns were with Starmie. Starmie speed ties with my Persian and has Surf, Thunder, Harden, and Swift. Typically, I'd go into Slowbro to take a hit from a fellow water type, but that's out of the question here. And because of Starmie's high speed, the chances I'll get hit with a crit is around 1 in 5 times. I decide to lead with Persian since at worst I would be speed tying with a Starmie, and at best I would outspeed his entire team. Thankfully, he led with Charizard, which means no Fire Spin abuse is going to happen. Unfortunately for me, Charizard stayed in and fired off a huge Fire Blast, causing my Persian to get burned in the process. I figured since Persian was burned, it was basically worthless now, and I decided to go for another Slash. Something to know about burns in Gen 1, if you get a critical hit, the damage reduction from being burned is ignored, and since my Persian is a crit machine, this burn damage wasn't actually that inconvenient and we're able to take out the Charizard. Something my opponent went on to say they weren't aware of either, and had they known, I feel they maybe would have saved their Charizard for later. Next comes in Nidoqueen. Now knowing my Persian is fine to crit away, I decide to save it and switch into Slowbro, eating the oncoming Earthquake really well. I fire off a Psychic as my opponent switch into Poliwag, which struggles to take the hit well, and on top of that, it gets its special stat reduced. My opponent then switches again, this time into Starmie. It takes the Psychic very well, and now there's pressure on me to switch out. I go into Snorlax to take the oncoming Thunder, and it winds up landing a critical hit, putting my Snorlax in danger of being taken out if Starmie winds up landing another. I go for Mega Kick, praying that I will be able to do some damage to this Starmie as my opponent switches into Poliwag. I figured this was them sacking Poliwag off for a safer switch into another Mon, but after the battle, I was told it was a misclick. Tauros comes in next. Before this tournament even begun, I was tinkering with some damage calcs, and the Pokemon I experimented with most was Tauros, Persian, and Snorlax. I know the IVs, or as they're referred to in Generation 1, the DVs of the rental Pokemon are different, meaning the damage calcs I did aren't going to be exact. But I had a good feeling, as long as Tauros didn't crit me, I could live a double edge and fire off a huge Mega Kick. So I stay in and do just that. My opponent switches into Starmie, most likely predicting me to switch into Graveler. This brings Starmie down to the red, making me feel a lot more comfortable about my position in this battle. I stay in once more as my Snorlax goes down to a critical hit Surf from the Starmie. I then send in Zapdos. Predicting the Nidoqueen to come in, I use Sky Attack. I got the call correct, but unfortunately I missed my attack. I was immediately vindicated as the Nidoqueen misses its Toxic. I decide to switch into Jinx. This time, the Toxic connects. Knowing my opponent is going to switch out, I decide to make use of Lovely Kiss. Tauros comes in and is put to sleep. This allows for an easy 2-hit KO from Jinx. My opponent sends in their own Jinx, and the fact that I'm poisoned is a blessing in disguise. I'm unable to be put to sleep now. The opposing Jinx fires off a Psychic and drops my special stat. That's fine by me, because I use Lovely Kiss again, putting the opposing Jinx to sleep. I decide to switch into Slowbro to chip away at the opposing Jinx, and as soon as it woke up, I switched back into my own Jinx to avoid the possibility of being put to sleep. It seems, however, my opponent decided to go for the freeze chance instead. Since we speed tie, it becomes a coin flip of which Jinx will prevail. I take a Psychic, then I fire off a Mega Punch, and the poison damage leaves me on 1 HP. I win the speed tie, and the next turn finish off my opponent's Jinx, leaving them with 2 Pokemon. And I don't fully understand how this works, but in Gen 1, if you knock out a Pokemon, you don't seem to ignore any negative effects that would come your way. It's why in Red and Blue, if you use Hyper Beam and you KO the Pokemon that you're using Hyper Beam on, it ignores the recharge turn. The same happened for the poison damage my Jinx should have taken. It was ignored, and my Jinx is still alive on 1 HP. Poisoned. That was short-lived, however. Starmie comes in and finishes off Jinx. Now I'm in a bit of a predicament. My opponent's remaining Pokemon are Starmie and Nidoqueen. Zapdos is a no-brainer to take on the Starmie, but if it switches into Nidoqueen, I'll wind up doing no damage with Thunderbolt, which allows Nidoqueen to chip away at my team. However, on the flip side, if I predict this switch and use Sky Attack, the Starmie could stay in, and with 2 lucky crits, it could easily take out Zapdos. I decide to play it safe and fire off a Thunderbolt as my opponent switches into Nidoqueen. Predicting my switch to Graveler, my opponent then switched back into Starmie. At this point, I let my Graveler go, so I can send in Zapdos again and go for the Sky Attack play. Besides winning the speed tie with Persian to take out Starmie, it's my best bet. Thankfully, this time Sky Attack connects and does over half of the Nidoqueen's health. My Zapdos gets poisoned, but that's okay. Nidoqueen doesn't have anything to really hurt me with, so I charge up another Sky Attack and get rid of the Nidoqueen. At this point, I was told that based on the DVs, Rental Persian should always outspeed Rental Starmie. I was personally playing under the assumption each Pokemon had max stats, but knowing this sooner would have saved me some worry. Zapdos finally gets to take out Starmie, and we win 3-0 in our favor. My opponent had a very threatening team, but because of a few over predictions on their part, I was able to walk away with a win. And with that, I'm in the finals. I won the winner's bracket, and my reward for doing so is whoever I face from the loser's bracket has to beat me twice in order to be considered first place. Owen and Just Weavile were battling each other to determine which of the two would face me in the finals, and I wasn't sure who I'd rather battle. On one hand, I had just beat Owen, which gave me the confidence that I could do it again. However, now that he'd battled me, he'll be more familiar with my playstyle and can readjust next time around. Then there's Just Weavile. Personally, I think Just Weavile has one of the scariest teams in this tournament. Instead of choosing Zapdos, he chose Articuno, which allowed him to bring Jolteon instead. Jolteon is tied with Aerodactyl and Mewtwo for having the second best speed stat in the game, meaning he always has the speed advantage unless someone brought Electrode. On top of that, Articuno is a huge threat with Substitute and Ice Beam. Like I mentioned earlier, if anything gets frozen, it's impossible for them to unthaw. He also has Starmie, Tauros, and Kadabra, which we've already determined are threatening Pokemon. And worst of all, Just Weavile is the only other person in the tournament that saw the potential in Graveler. I watched their battle from start to finish, and it was a close one. Owen was on track to winning, but unfortunately misclicked with Nidoqueen, going for a Bite instead of Earthquake, which in the end cost him the battle. That means the finals will be between myself and Just Weavile. I decided to lead with Snorlax, so I could take on what I was predicting to be the Jolteon lead. It wound up being Starmie, which is also fine. My opponent switches to Graveler to take the Mega Kick. It does roughly 20% damage. I switch to Slowbro to take an oncoming Earthquake, which hurt a bit more than I anticipated. I fire off a Psychic, fishing for a special drop on the incoming Starmie, and I get it. Ready to take a Thunder, I switch back to Snorlax, and of course, I'm met with a critical hit. Predicting Graveler to come in, I double swap to my Jinx, and I predicted correctly. I fire off a Lovely Kiss trying to sleep the Starmie as Kadabra comes in and evades the attack. Since Kadabra can't do much to me, I stay in and Lovely Kiss again, this time connecting. That's when I fire off Ice Punch as my opponent switches into Starmie. I land the 10% chance to freeze, and like I said earlier, this is a death sentence for your Pokemon. So while Starmie is technically alive, it literally can't do anything unless it's hit with a fire attack or if I use Haze, neither of which are going to happen. My opponent stays in with Starmie to let it die, and then gets a clean switch into their Tauros. I switch to Graveler to take any oncoming attack, and my opponent does the same. I can only imagine he was predicting me to send in Zapdos or Snorlax. I decide I want to keep my Graveler healthy to take out the Jolteon, so I swap into Snorlax to sack it off. I send in my Slowbro and decide to play it safe and go for Surf, on the off chance his Graveler stayed in. However, Jolteon came in and took a critical hit Surf, which takes it down to about 30% health. Now I'm at a crossroads. I can stay in, predict a Toxic, and finish off the Jolteon, or I can make the safe play and swap into Graveler, and take the potential Toxic. I make the safe play, because there's no sense in throwing my Slowbro away when I already have a pretty good lead. It was at this point when my opponent disconnected, unintentionally of course. Thankfully, the Nintendo Switch Online service allowed him to join back and continue playing as if nothing happened. However, I won't lie, this definitely threw me off my groove a bit because of the sheer panic of maybe having to redo the battle. I had lost my train of thought, and because of that, I got reckless. I swapped back into Slowbro predicting my opponent to switch out of Jolteon, and he doesn't. He fires off a Thunderbolt and my Slowbro goes down. This was a huge loss for me. Slowbro answered my opponent's Graveler and is my number one switch against Articuno. With my 2 walls down, I have to really climb myself out of this hole I dug. I send in Jinx, knowing I can live whatever Jolteon throws at me, and I take out the Jolteon with a Psychic. Tauros comes in, so I swap into Graveler as my opponent predicts this and goes into Articuno. I've fallen behind and I desperately need to catch up if I want to win. I let my Graveler go. Since Jolteon is gone, I have less of a need for it, and the last thing I need is Articuno setting up a substitute. I decide to send in Persian. I figured if I can possibly 2-hit KO the Zapdos, maybe it could also 2-hit KO an Articuno. Unfortunately, that isn't the case, and Articuno takes the hit just well enough that I would have to attack 3 times to KO it. Thankfully, I didn't get frozen, and I take the opportunity to switch to Jinx to maybe live and hit back with a Psychic. Unfortunately, Jinx gets crit, and only 2 of my Pokemon remain. I send in Zapdos. I figured Thunderbolt should be enough to take out Articuno since it's super effective and stab. I was right, and I'm so happy that major threat has been dealt with. Unfortunately, my opponent still has Graveler. My only way of dealing with this would be to use Bubble Beam from Persian, but getting Persian in safely against Graveler is not going to be easy. I figured Graveler was going to self-destruct to take my Zapdos down as low as possible for Tauros to finish it off. All I can do is use Flash and hope for the best. Flash connects, and is enough to make my opponent's Graveler miss his self-destruct, leaving my Zapdos at full health to take on a Sleeping Kadabra and a Tauros. This one turn changed the tide of the match. Kadabra comes in, and Zapdos takes it out in 3 hits, not before taking a little bit of psychic damage however. That leaves my opponent's final Pokemon, Tauros. Tauros isn't able to get a critical hit, meaning my Zapdos lives, and is able to put Tauros in range of being taken out by a Slash from my Persian. And just like that, I was crowned the winner of the Pokemon Stadium tournament. The last battle was so full of RNG, I truly believe it could have went either way. Like I mentioned prior, had I lost that battle, I had to be beaten twice in order to truly lose. But with how much RNG there was in that fight alone, anything could have happened. My prize for winning was $100, which is great because I would have been happy enough with just the satisfaction of winning. I really enjoyed my time battling in this mini tournament and I hope you enjoyed hearing about it. If you did, feel free to share this video with a friend. It helps more than you know. Thank you for watching.